A headless woman haunts the Harecastle Tunnel. A ghost apprehended in Shelton. A fearsome, giant, ghostly... bunny rabbit? Really? Hey up everyone, welcome back to the Stokie Towk Podcast on the channel dedicated to the Potteries dialect and the history and culture of North Staffordshire. Now this week's topic is the weirdest ghost and paranormal stories from Stoke-on-Trent. Now Stoke-on-Trent is quite popular amongst ghost hunters for its array of really old buildings, many in a derelict state and ripe with ghosts, allegedly. So it sort of draws paranormal explorers from all over. And there are loads and loads of individual small cases of hauntings and paranormal stories from all over the city. But today we're going to focus on three of the weirdest ones, and the ones that stand out in history. Now, just a small caveat, I'm not going to be talking about Molly Lee in this episode, and the main reason is that despite Molly Lee being obviously the most famous ghost story from Stoke-on-Trent, I have covered that topic to death on this channel and on my other channel. So if you do want to learn more about Molly Lee's story, I will post links in the description to all of my other episodes about Molly Lee, and you can watch them at your leisure, but I'm not going to talk about Molly Lee in this episode. So let's dive in then. Now, the first story I mentioned was a headless woman who haunts the Harecastle Tunnel. Now, if you don't know, the Harecastle Tunnel is one of the marvels of the Industrial Revolution. It's a huge canal tunnel that goes underground around about the Golden Hill area and comes out the other side of Kidsgrove. And it's actually two tunnels. The original one was built by James Brindley in the 18th century, and then there was a later one added by Thomas Telford in the 19th century, and that one's still in use to this day. Now, Brindley's tunnel collapsed sometime in the 20th century, and the tunnel was really narrow and quite claustrophobic, and the only way to get through it was by legging. That's the practice of sort of lying on your back in your barge and just kicking the wall until you got through to the other side, and the tunnel's about a mile long, so you can imagine how long that took and what an unpleasant experience it was. And this ghost story originates in Liverpool, allegedly, where a lady was asking for a lift down to London, and the crew of a passing coal barge obliged her. Now, this lady allegedly ended up falling out with some of the crew on the way, or one of them was attracted to her, and she shunned him, or something like that in a few variations of the story, but it all come to a head when they reached the Harecastle Tunnel. Now, as I mentioned, the only way to get through this tunnel at the time was by legging, so that usually meant that half the crew had to vacate the vessel, and they'd have to go up and over the hill. And usually they'd have to take a lot of the cargo with them because the tunnel roof was quite low. So the practice commonly was to get off before the tunnel, load up your pack horses and stuff, and half the crew head up over the hill, and they'd meet the boat on the other side while a couple of blokes legged it through the tunnel. Now, it seems that the lady elected to stay in the barge at this time instead of going up and over the hill, and it's here that the alleged murder took place. Apparently she was strangled on her way through the tunnel, and in some versions of the story she was beheaded as well. Apparently these men were never brought to justice for this terrible crime, and her restless spirit haunts the tunnel to this day, appearing as a headless spectre to weary travellers going through the tunnel, with several confirmed sightings throughout history. Now, interestingly, this ghost is referred to locally as the Kidsgrove Boggart. Now, a boggart is like a ghost that's tied to one certain place, so in this case the Harecastle Tunnel, so she rarely wanders away from there. But a boggart sometimes has the powers of prophecy, and there are a few documented stories of her appearing to local people before disasters are about to strike of one form or another, pre-warning them. Those stories again vary from form to form, but there are a few of them documented in local blogs and that sort of thing, and she continued to be cited right up until the 20th century. So, is this story true? Is there a ghost haunting the Harecastle Tunnel? Actually, the story behind it doesn't appear to be true at all, or at least it wasn't documented in any newspapers at the time, either in Liverpool, in Stoke-on-Trent or anywhere else. And you'd kind of imagine that it would be quite difficult to hide such a thing. Surely somebody would have noticed. I mean, there were crews on this tunnel, you had to pay a toll to go through it as well, so there were toll booths at one end or the other, so you wouldn't have been able to hide it, I wouldn't have thought. I suppose it's not inconceivable that they might not have noticed that they went in with a lady at one end and then came out without her. I can't imagine there was much communication between the two ends of the tunnel at that time. This was before the age of the telephone and everything, obviously, and there's a whacking great hill between you. So I imagine the two sort of operated independently. So I guess it's plausible that somebody might go into the tunnel and not come out and nobody would notice. But I mean, the canal inside the tunnel is not exactly deep, so I don't exactly know what the logistics would be to be hiding a body in the water there. Surely it would surface at some point. But the fact that the events of this story vary so much from version to version, and there's no documented recordings of a murder happening at the time, it sounds rather far-fetched, and I think the story is actually false. There are variations of this kind of story up and down the land, like somebody murdered on the canal and that sort of thing. Seems to be pretty copy and paste from those kind of stories. So what about the ghost? Well, there have certainly been documented sightings of it over the years, but again, the details vary. Some say that the ghost is a headless person, which would kind of fit the narrative of her being beheaded, and others just that she's a ghostly apparition of a woman in sort of period dress. I mean, the idea of beheading the victim seems a bit far-fetched, to be honest. It's quite grisly. I can't imagine why anyone would want to do that, rather than, just strangling the person and tossing them overboard. The logistics of actually beheading someone in a narrow, dark tunnel seem to be ridiculous to me. But yes, apparently the ghost is sometimes headless or carrying a head. Again, that sort of trope is not uncommon either. It happens with the ghost of, say, like Catherine Howard at Hampton Court Palace and that sort of thing. So that's also a common trope throughout history. As for the stories of the prophecies and it being a boggart, again, there are a few reported instances, but nothing particularly verifiable, as you'd imagine. But this one does live on in popular conscience in the area. It's definitely become part of the identity of the tunnel. And as I said, it was a really unpleasant experience trying to get through the tunnel. It was claustrophobic, it was dark, you'd be exhausted by the time you got to the end of it, so it's probably not inconceivable that some people heard strange noises or saw strange things. And later on in Telford's tunnel, at first at least, the ventilation was very poor. So in the age where barges began to have engines, there was very poor ventilation in the tunnel at first, so there's no, it's not inconceivable that these people were not getting high off the fumes and that sort of thing, and maybe hallucinating or something like that. And obviously there'd be lots of strange noises associated with a tunnel like that coming from all over, especially when the ventilation system was added. So, as a ghost story, it's got quite an elaborate backstory behind it, but unfortunately that backstory doesn't appear to be true at all. So, if there is a ghost haunting the Harecastle Tunnel, we have absolutely no idea how it got there or why. So what about the second story then? The ghost that was allegedly apprehended. So the story goes that in 1886 there was a ghostly sighting reported in Shelton. Somebody reported seeing a ghost wandering amongst the gravestones in Shelton churchyard, and this report allegedly stirred up quite a panic enough to attract a crowd of people who also stood there gawping as they couldn't believe their eyes when they all saw this ghost wandering through the churchyard. Some of the crowd grew restless and started shouting at the ghost, unable to attract its attention. And then some people let loose with stones to try and drive it away. It was then that it came to a head when one of the stones clocked the ghosts and it let out a cry. In some versions of the story, the crowd then ran towards the ghost and tackled it to the ground, restraining it. It was later handed over to the local police, and apparently given a caution to never haunt the place again, before being sent on its way, presumably back to the underworld, or wherever ghosts come from. So yeah, this is not your typical ghost story, it's quite a weird one. But is it true? I'd absolutely love it to be, cause that is hilarious, to be honest. And it was apparently reported in newspapers at the time that this incident had happened. But that source comes from a blog by sort of local historians, and I've not been able to find any references to it in the actual papers themselves. That's not to say that it wasn't reported. Maybe if I went and dug through all the Sentinel archives and stuff, I might find a reference to it. But all I've got so far are sort of loose mentions online that, yeah, this was reported in the local paper. I don't know what elements of the story are true. Some of it seems really far-fetched. I mean, if they did really see a ghost wandering the churchyard and then a crowd gathered who also saw it and then started shouting towards it, surely if the thing in question didn't want to be mistaken for a ghost, it would have said, "What on earth are you doing?" and shouted back. Of course, Shelton churchyard isn't massive, so I'm sure the ghost, or the alleged ghost, would have actually noticed this crowd of people gathering and be slightly concerned that they were shouting stuff at them. I can't imagine it would have taken stones to be thrown at them to get their attention. So what about the rest of it? Was the ghost apprehended and handed over to the police? Well, in some versions of the story, no. It was a local militiaman who was part of the Hanley militia, who apparently at the time all wore white, and he was patrolling the churchyard, and it was just a misunderstanding, and the crowd just laughed about it and went on their merry way. And in another version of the story, it was actually a notorious prankster who was deliberately pretending to be a ghost to try and wind people up. Apparently this person was a former beer seller, and he was known throughout the community for playing practical jokes. In this version of the story, yes, he was handed over to the police, who cautioned him not to cause a mass panic again. Does this sound plausible? Well, the militia story seems a bit odd, because this is 1886 we're talking about, not 1786. We did have a police force by this point, so I can't imagine a local militia was needed by then. And I can't imagine a local militia would be dressed all in white, or resemble a ghost in any way. As I said, Shelton churchyard isn't massive, so I can't imagine they were seeing it from like half a mile away, or something like that. As for the practical jokester, that seems more plausible. Apparently, this person was wearing sort of like a white women's nightdress and just wandering amongst the gravestones. It would also explain why he ignored the crowd at first until it got a bit heated when they started throwing stuff at him. So if I was going to believe a version of the story, it would probably be that one. And it was that version that was allegedly reported in the paper, but as I said, I've not been able to confirm that. If it was, then hats off to this guy, because that is hilarious that he was able to con so many people into thinking he was a ghost that he had to be arrested. So yeah, I really want that to be true. So what about this last story then? Stoke's own spectral version of the killer rabbit of Caerbannog. Well, so the story goes, there is indeed a large, ghostly white bunny rabbit that haunts the streets of Cobridge and the area of what is now Festival Park. Legend has it that this white rabbit is spotted late at night and lets out a blood-curdling scream before running towards the victim and then just mysteriously disappearing into thin air. Now, this story was first told in the Victorian era, but there have been several alleged sightings since, with one poor bloke even trying to catch it apparently, being left with a broken shoulder for his troubles. Clearly he should have used the holy hand grenade of Antioch instead. But one presumes that this spectral rabbit is still at large somewhere, although I haven't been able to find the last confirmed sighting of it. So is this story true? Well, this one does have some basis in historical fact, actually, because so the story goes that this restless ghost is that of a person who was murdered in the 1830s, allegedly over a gambling debt. And unlike the previous story, this one was definitely reported in newspapers, even as far away as Glasgow. That just goes to show that local newspapers copying and pasting each other's stories is nothing new. It's been going on for centuries. The ghost is the restless spirit of a young man named John Holdcroft, who was indeed murdered in Cobridge back in the 1830s, and as I mentioned, allegedly it was about an unpaid gambling debt. But why the white rabbit? Well, believe it or not, this isn't actually unique. It's actually quite common throughout the UK to see ghosts of rabbits. And I think it has its origin in more superstitious times. The image of a white rabbit sort of represents innocence. So it's not inconceivable that someone who was the victim of a crime would come back in such a form. These sort of sightings seem to have become more common in more industrial landscapes. And it's sort of harking back to a time when, the land belonged to nature. And it was green and pleasant. Before all these evil factories came along. Not to go all William Blake on you or anything. In fact, I'd like to research it a bit further, so if I can dig up any more evidence on it, I might actually make a new video just about that. So are there any other curious ghostly anecdotes from North Staffordshire? Well, I can think of a few honourable mentions that I come across while researching for this episode. The first was a ghostly horseman up around Tork and Tork Pits, which seems to share many of the classic headless horseman tropes with other similar stories throughout the UK. And the other interesting one was a ghostly hitchhiker on the A34 near to the Royal Stoke Hospital. And there are a few stories where drivers have claimed to have seen this man, only for him to have mysteriously vanished when they look in their rear-view mirror. And this story is actually quite a recent one. It seems to have only come up in sort of the last 20 years or so. How about generally haunted locations with some interesting stories behind them? Well, there are a few. One of the most famous examples is probably the Gladstone Pottery Museum in Longton. And as you can imagine, a place with lots of old preserved buildings is probably a hive for paranormal activity and very popular amongst ghost hunters. I have to say I've been to Gladstone Pottery Museum several times, and I can't say I felt particularly uneasy there or, got the impression that it was haunted at all, but I've never been there after dark. But I do know people who've worked there in the past, and they were absolutely 100% convinced that the place was haunted. They hated working there on their own at night. There were places where they just wouldn't want to go. There were plenty of rooms in there where, you heard weird noises, jars rattling, doors closing, unusually cold spots and that sort of thing. So yeah, it was enough to frighten the staff that worked there. I'm not really here to debunk whether or not these ghosts exist and why people experience them and all that whatnot. It's not really my area of expertise. But Gladstone Pottery was interesting enough to attract the crew of Most Haunted, which was a sort of TV series where they did ghost hunts and that sort of thing. And they usually had like a psychic medium on the team who attempted to speak to spirits sort of on the fly while they were on location. And one such incident happened in the doctor's surgery at the Gladstone Pottery Museum, where the medium tried to talk to some spirits in there. He sensed some presence, and he said he sensed the presence of sick people waiting and that sort of thing. And the main interesting point about that is that the doctor's surgery at Gladstone Pottery Museum was never actually a doctor's surgery originally. It was just a room that was made up to look like a doctor's for the museum. I think it's probably dates from like the 1980s. And many pottery factories, including Gladstone, did have like a doctor's surgery on site to cater for the workers, but at Gladstone Pottery it was actually way over the other side of the site. So it just raised a few titters when he started talking to spirits of sick people in a place that was never actually a doctor's surgery. Again, not criticising too much, because, that show was primarily an entertainment show, so, you can't read too much into it, I suppose. Another one just down the road from Gladstone Pottery Museum is Short Street, which is a very popular destination for sort of paranormal and ghost hunters. And there have been all sorts of claims there over the years, spooky noises, unexplained smells of tobacco smoke, and all the usual stuff. Now, it does feel eerie. I mean, I can't imagine wanting to walk down that street at night, to be honest. It's like a preserved cobbled street, and it actually has a set of former potters' cottages that are over 150 years old there, that have been restored. And yes, it's poorly lit. It's sort of in the back and beyond. Yeah, it's not the sort of place you'd feel easy walking down on your own at night, I think. But it certainly does have a rich history. A lot of the paranormal experiences are sort of associated with the cottages, but interestingly, these cottages aren't actually complete. It's just the facade. So there are actually no rooms or anything, and if you went through the door, there'd be nothing on the other side at the minute. So the stories of sort of seeing ghostly figures in the windows and that sort of thing is a bit odd. But nonetheless, I can certainly see the appeal to this if, like, paranormal and ghost hunting is your thing. It's a really atmospheric place, and, if that's your bag, it's certainly a place you'd want to go. The last one I wanted to talk about was the Leopard Pub in Burslem, which is sadly closed now and is in a derelict state because it got gutted by a fire a few years ago. It's a real shame because it was a really nice historic pub, centuries old. But the pub was actually only a small part of it, and if you went in the back, there was an absolute maze of corridors and old rooms back from the time when it used to be an inn. And apparently it was rife with paranormal activity. It was a really popular destination for ghost hunts and sleepovers and that sort of thing. Yeah, sadly it is. It is no more. I actually miss it for just being a really nice pub, and it used to do really interesting events. I once attended a lecture there on the social history of tea towels, which is just the kind of quality entertainment you don't get at many pubs, And sadly the latest news is that it's been bought by an investor and it's going to be turned into a block of flats, which seems to be the direction that a lot of historic buildings in Stoke-on-Trent are taking. With this, Tunstall Swimming Baths, Hanley Library, and I'm sure there are many, many more. Almost feels like the city's becoming a sort of microcosm for the modern world, where these once vital pieces of public infrastructure are just being turned into flats and sold off to the highest bidder. But, not to get too political on this channel, I do intend to stick to the history and sort of nostalgia rather than current events. And I don't intend this to become a political channel, so we'll leave it there. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Are you familiar with any of these stories that we discussed today, and have you heard any more details or curious nuances about them? Of course, with these kind of stories, there tends to be a lot of different variations. How about other ghost stories from Stoke-on-Trent and North Staffordshire? Are there any more that you're familiar with? Are there any more that you'd like to share? Let me know down below in the comments. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll say thee again next time.